Legends tell of a spectral black monk who last appeared 1,000 years ago. When he appears to Kovrin, does it mean he is insane or inspired? Anton Chekhov, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The vintage episode for the week is Frankenstein, Part 8 of 8 by Mary Shelley. Be sure to check it out on Tuesday. If you have found value in the show, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. Help us to help other folks like you. Please go to ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com and become a monthly supporter today. I think you'll find we make it worth your while. Insanity or inspiration? Today's story follows Kovrin, an overworked scholar and young professor who takes a long break in visiting the family who raised him. But when he sees the fabled black monk, is it a sign of insanity or is it inspiration? Chekhov explores themes of the selfish genius, contrasting that with selfless sacrificing for family. I hope you like it. And now, The Black Monk, Part 1 of 2 by Anton Chekhov. One. Andrei Vasilyich Kovrin, who held a master's degree at the university, had exhausted himself and had upset his nerves. He did not send for a doctor, but casually, over a bottle of wine, he spoke to a friend who was a doctor, and the latter advised him to spend the spring and summer in the country. Very opportunely, a long letter came from Tanya Pesotsky, who asked him to come and stay with them at Borisovka, and he made up his mind that he really must go. To begin with, that was in April. He went to his own home, Kovrinka, and there spent 3 weeks in solitude. Then, as soon as the roads were in good condition, he set off, driving in a carriage, to visit Pesotsky, his former guardian, who had brought him up, and was a horticulturist, well known all over Russia. The distance from Kovrinka to Borisovka was reckoned only a little over 50 miles. To drive along a soft road in May in a comfortable carriage with springs was a real pleasure. Pesotsky had an immense house with columns and lions, off which the stucco was peeling, and with a footman in swallowtails at the entrance. The old park, laid out in the English style, gloomy and severe, stretched for almost 3/4 of a mile to the river, and there ended in a steep, precipitous clay bank, where pines grew with bare roots that looked like shaggy paws. The water shone below with an unfriendly gleam, and the peewits flew up with a plaintive cry, and there one always felt that one must sit down and write a ballad. But near the house itself, in the courtyard and orchard, which together with the nurseries covered 90 acres, it was all life and gaiety even in bad weather. Such marvelous roses, lilies, camellias, such tulips of all possible shades, from glistening white to sooty black. Such a wealth of flowers, in fact, Kovrin had never seen anywhere as at Pesotsky's. It was only the beginning of spring, and the real glory of the flower beds was still hidden away in the hothouses. But even the flowers along the avenues, and here and there in the flower beds, were enough to make one feel, as one walked about the garden, as though one were in a realm of tender colors, especially in the early morning, when the dew was glistening on every petal. What was the decorative part of the garden, and what Pesotsky contemptuously spoke of as rubbish, had at one time in his childhood given Kovrin an impression of fairyland. Every sort of caprice, of elaborate monstrosity and mockery at nature, was here. There were espaliers of fruit trees, a pear tree in the shape of a pyramidal poplar, spherical oaks and lime trees, an apple tree in the shape of an umbrella, plum trees trained into arches, crests candelabra, and even into the number 1862, the year when Pesotski first took up horticulture. One came across, too, lovely graceful trees, with strong, straight stems like palms, and it was only by looking intently that one could recognize these trees as gooseberries or currants. But what made the garden most cheerful and gave it a lively air was the continual coming and going in it. From early morning till evening, people with wheelbarrows, shovels, and watering cans swarmed round the trees and bushes, in the avenues and the flower beds, like ants. Kovrin arrived at Pesotski's at 10 o'clock in the evening. He found Tanya and her father, Yegor Semyonich, in great anxiety. The clear starlight sky and the thermometer foretold a frost towards morning, and meanwhile Ivan Karlovich, the gardener, had gone to the town, and they had no one to rely upon. At supper they talked of nothing but the morning frost, and it was settled that Tanya should not go to bed, and between 12 and 1 should walk through the garden and see that everything was done properly, and Yegor Semyonich should get up at 3 o'clock or even earlier. Kovrin sat with Tanya all the evening, and after midnight went out with her into the garden. It was cold. There was a strong smell of burning already in the garden. In the big orchard, which was called the commercial garden, and which brought Yegor Semyonich several thousand clear profit, a thick, black, acrid smoke was creeping over the ground, and, curling around the trees, was saving those thousands from the frost. Here the trees were arranged as on a chessboard, in straight and regular rows like ranks of soldiers, and this severe pedantic regularity, and the fact that all the trees were of the same size, and had tops and trunks all exactly alike, made them look monotonous and even dreary. Kovrin and Tanya walked along the rows where fires of dung, straw, and all sorts of refuse were smoldering, and from time to time they were met by laborers, who wandered in the smoke like shadows. The only trees in flower were the cherries, plums, and certain sorts of apples, but the whole garden was plunged in smoke, and it was only near the nurseries that Kovrin could breathe freely. "Even as a child I used to sneeze from the smoke here," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "But to this day I don't understand how smoke can keep off frost." "Smoke takes the place of clouds when there are none," answered Tanya. "And what do you want clouds for?" "In overcast and cloudy weather there is no frost." "You don't say so." He laughed and took her arm. Her broad, very earnest face, chilled with the frost, with her delicate black eyebrows, the turned-up collar of her coat, which prevented her moving her head freely, and the whole of her thin, graceful figure, with her skirts tucked up on account of the dew, touched him. "Good heavens, she has grown up," he said. "When I went away from here last, 5 years ago, you were still a child. You were such a thin, long-legged creature, with your hair hanging on your shoulders. You used to wear short frocks, and I used to tease you, calling you a heron. What time does." "Yes, 5 years," sighed Tanya. "Much water has flowed since then. Tell me, Andrusha, honestly," she began eagerly, looking him in the face. "Do you feel strange with us now? But why do I ask you? You are a man. You live your own interesting life. You are somebody. To grow apart is so natural. But however that may be, Andrusha, I want you to think of us as your people. We have a right to that." "I do, Tanya." "On your word of honor?" "Yes, on my word of honor." "You were surprised this evening that we have so many of your photographs. You know my father adores you. Sometimes it seems to me that he loves you more than he does me. He is proud of you. You are a clever, extraordinary man. You have made a brilliant career for yourself, and he is persuaded that you have turned out like this because he brought you up. I don't try to prevent him from thinking so. Let him." Dawn was already beginning, and that was especially perceptible from the distinctness with which the coils of smoke and the tops of the trees began to stand out in the air. "It's time we were asleep, though," said Tanya. "And it's cold, too." She took his arm. "Thank you for coming, Andrusha. We have only uninteresting acquaintances, and not many of them. We have only the garden, and nothing else. Standards, half-standards," she laughed. "Apports, reinettes, borovinkas, budded stalks, grafted stalks, all our life has gone into the garden. I never even dream of anything but apples and pears. Of course, it is all very nice and useful, but sometimes one longs for something else, for variety. I remember that when you used to come to us for the summer holidays, or simply a visit, it always seemed to be fresher and brighter in the house, as though the covers had been taken off the lustres and the furniture. I was only a little girl then, but yet I understood it." She talked a long while, and with great feeling. For some reason the idea came into his head that in the course of the summer he might grow fond of this little, weak, talkative creature, might be carried away and fall in love. In their position it was so possible and natural. This thought touched and amused him. He bent down to her sweet, preoccupied face and hummed softly, "Onyegin, I won't conceal it. I madly love Tatiana." By the time they reached the house, Yegor Semyonich had got up. Kovrin did not feel sleepy. He talked to the old man and went to the garden with him. Yegor Semyonich was a tall, broad-shouldered, corpulent man, and he suffered from asthma. Yet he walked so fast that it was hard work to hurry after him. He had an extremely preoccupied air. He was always hurrying somewhere, with an expression that suggested that if he were 1 minute late, all would be ruined. "Here is a business, brother," he began, standing still to take breath. "On the surface of the ground, as you see, is frost. But if you raise the thermometer on a stick 14 feet above the ground, there it is warm. Why is that?" "I really don't know," said Kovrin, and he laughed. "One can't know everything, of course. However large the intellect may be, you can't find room for everything in it. I suppose you still go in chiefly for philosophy?" "Yes, I lecture in psychology. I am working at philosophy in general." "And it does not bore you?" "On the contrary, it's all I live for." "Well, God bless you," said Yegor Semyonich, meditatively stroking his grey whiskers. "God bless you. I am delighted about you. Delighted, my boy." But suddenly he listened, and with a terrible face, ran off and quickly disappeared behind the trees in a cloud of smoke. "Who tied this horse to an apple tree?" Kovrin heard his despairing, heart-rending cry. "Who is the low scoundrel who has dared to tie this horse to an apple tree? My God, they have ruined everything. They have spoiled everything. They have done everything filthy, horrible, and abominable. The orchard's done for. The orchard's ruined. My God!" When he came back to Kovrin, his face looked exhausted and mortified. "What is one to do with these accursed people?" he said in a tearful voice, flinging up his hands. "Stjopka was carting dung at night and tied the horse to an apple tree. He twisted the reins round it, the rascal, as tightly as he could, so that the bark is rubbed off in 3 places. What do you think of that? I spoke to him as he stands like a post, and he blinks his eyes. Hanging is too good for him." Growing calmer, he embraced Kovrin and kissed him on the cheek. "Well, God bless you, God bless you," he muttered. "I am very glad you have come. Unutterably glad. Thank you." Then, with the same rapid step and preoccupied face, he made the round of the whole garden and showed his former ward all his greenhouses and hothouses, his covered-in garden, and 2 apiaries, which he called the marvel of our century. While they were walking, the sun rose, flooding the garden with brilliant light. It grew warm. Foreseeing a long, bright, cheerful day, Kovrin recollected that it was only the beginning of May, and that he had before him a whole summer, as bright cheerful and long. And suddenly there stirred in his bosom a joyous, youthful feeling, such as he used to experience in his childhood, running about in that garden. And he hugged the old man and kissed him affectionately. Both of them, feeling touched, went indoors and drank tea out of old-fashioned china cups with cream and satisfying crendels made with milk and eggs. And these trifles reminded Kovrin again of his childhood and boyhood. The delightful present was blended with the impressions of the past that stirred within him. There was a tightness at his heart, yet he was happy. He waited till Tanya was awake and had coffee with her, went for a walk, then went to his room and sat down to work. He read attentively, making notes, and from time to time raised his eyes to look out at the open windows, or at the fresh, still dewy flowers in the vases on the table. And again, he dropped his eyes to his book, and it seemed to him as though every vein in his body was quivering and fluttering with pleasure. 2. In the country, he led just as nervous and restless a life as in town. He read and wrote a great deal. He studied Italian, and when he was out for a walk, thought with pleasure that he would soon sit down to work again. He slept so little that everyone wondered at him. If he accidentally dozed for half an hour in the daytime, he would lie awake all night, and after a sleepless night, would feel cheerful and vigorous, as though nothing had happened. He talked a great deal, drank wine, and smoked expensive cigars. Very often, almost every day, young ladies of neighboring families would come to the Pesotskis, and would sing and play the piano with Tanya. Sometimes a young neighbor who was a good violinist would come too. Kovrin listened with eagerness to the music and singing, and was exhausted by it. And this showed itself by his eyes closing and his head falling to one side. One day he was sitting on the balcony after evening tea, reading. At the same time, in the drawing-room, Tanya, taking soprano, one of the young ladies a contralto, and the young man with his violin, were practicing a well-known serenade of Bragas. Kovrin listened to the words. They were Russian, and could not understand their meaning. At last, leaving his book and listening attentively, he understood. A maiden, full of sick fancies, heard one night in her garden mysterious sounds, so strange and lovely that she was obliged to recognize them as a holy harmony, which is unintelligible to us mortals, and so flies back to heaven. Kovrin's eyes began to close. He got up, and in exhaustion walked up and down the drawing-room, then the dining-room. When the singing was over, he took Tanya's arm, and with her went out on the balcony. "I have been all day thinking of a legend," he said. "I don't remember whether I have read it somewhere or heard it, but it is a strange and almost grotesque legend. To begin with, it is somewhat obscure. 1,000 years ago, a monk, dressed in black, wandered about the desert, somewhere in Syria or Arabia. Some miles from where he was, some fishermen saw another black monk, who was moving slowly over the surface of a lake. This second monk was a mirage. Now forget all the laws of optics, which the legend does not recognize, and listen to the rest. From that mirage there was cast another mirage, then from that other a third, so that the image of the black monk began to be repeated endlessly from one layer of the atmosphere to another, so that he was seen at one time in Africa, at another in Spain, then in Italy, then in the far north. Then he passed out of the atmosphere of the earth, and now he is wandering all over the universe, still never coming into conditions in which he might disappear. Possibly he may be seen now in Mars, or some star of the Southern Cross. But, my dear, the real point on which the whole legend hangs lies in the fact that exactly 1,000 years from the day when the monk walked in the desert, the mirage will return to the atmosphere of the earth again, and will appear to men. And it seems that the 1,000 years is almost up. According to the legend, we may look out for the black monk today or tomorrow." "A queer mirage," said Tanya, who did not like the legend. "But the most wonderful part of it all," laughed Kovrin, "is that I simply cannot recall where I got this legend from. Have I read it from somewhere? Have I heard it? Or perhaps I dreamt of the black monk. I swear I don't remember. But the legend interests me. I have been thinking about it all day." Letting Tanya go back to her visitors, he went out of the house and, lost in meditation, walked by the flower beds. The sun was already setting. The flowers, having just been watered, gave forth a damp, irritating fragrance. Indoors they began singing again, and in the distance the violin had the effect of a human voice. Kovrin, racking his brains to remember where he had read or heard the legend, turned slowly towards the park, and unconsciously went as far as the river. By a little path that ran along the steep bank, between the bare roots, he went down to the water, disturbed the peewits there, and frightened 2 ducks. The last rays of the setting sun still threw light here and there on the gloomy pines, but it was quite dark on the surface of the river. Kovrin crossed to the other side by the narrow bridge. Before him lay a wide field, covered with young rye, not yet in blossom. There was no living habitation, no living soul in the distance, and it seemed as though the little path, if one went along it, would take one to the unknown, mysterious place, where the sun had just gone down, and where the evening glow was flaming in immensity and splendor. "How open, how free, how still it is here," thought Kovrin, walking along the path. "And it feels as though all the world were watching me, hiding and waiting for me to understand it." But then waves began running across the rye, and a light evening breeze softly touched his uncovered head. A minute later, there was another gust of wind, but stronger. The rye began rustling, and he heard behind him the hollow murmur of the pines. Kovrin stood still in amazement. From the horizon, there rose up to the sky, like a whirlwind or a waterspout, a tall, black column. Its outline was indistinct, but from the first instant it could be seen that it was not standing still, but moving with fearful rapidity, moving straight towards Kovrin, and the nearer it came, the smaller and more distinct it was. Kovrin moved aside into the rye to make way for it, and only just had time to do so. A monk, dressed in black, with a grey head and black eyebrows, his arms crossed over his breast, floated by him. His bare feet did not touch the earth. After he had floated 20 feet beyond him, he looked round at Kovrin, and nodded to him with a friendly but sly smile. But what a pale, fearfully pale, thin face! Beginning to grow larger again, he flew across the river, collided noiselessly with the clay bank and pines, and passing through them, vanished like smoke. "Why, you see," muttered Kovrin, "there must be truth in the legend." Without trying to explain to himself the strange apparition, glad that he had succeeded in seeing so near and so distinctly, not only the monk's black garments, but even his face and eyes, agreeably excited, he went back to the house. In the park and in the garden, people were moving about quietly. In the house they were playing, so he alone had seen the monk. He had an intense desire to tell Tanya and Yegor Semyonich, but he reflected that they would certainly think his words the ravings of delirium, and that would frighten them. He had better say nothing. He laughed aloud, sang, and danced the mazurka. He was in high spirits, and all of them, the visitors and Tanya, thought he had a peculiar look, radiant and inspired, and that he was very interesting. 3. After supper, when the visitors had gone, he went to his room and lay down on the sofa. He wanted to think about the monk. But a minute later, Tanya came in.
"Here, Andrusha, read Father's articles,"
she said, giving him a bundle of pamphlets and proofs.
"They are splendid articles. He writes capitally."
"Capitally, indeed," said Yegor Semyonitch, following her and smiling constrainedly. He was ashamed. "Don't listen to her, please. Don't read them. Though if you want to go to sleep, read them by all means. They are a fine soporific."
"I think they are splendid articles,"
said Tanya with deep conviction.
"You read them, Andrusha, and persuade Father to write oftener. He could write a complete manual of horticulture."
Yegor Semyonitch gave a forced laugh, blushed, and began uttering the phrases usually made use of by an embarrassed author. At last he began to give way. "In that case, begin with Gauscher's article and these Russian articles," he muttered, turning over the pamphlets with a trembling hand. "Or else you won't understand. Before you read my objections, you must know what I am objecting to. But it's all nonsense, tiresome stuff. Besides, I believe it's bedtime." Tanya went away. Yegor Semyonitch sat down on the sofa by Kovrin and heaved a deep sigh. "Yes, my boy," he began after a pause. "That's how it is, my dear lecturer. Here I write articles and take part in exhibitions and receive medals. Pesotsky, they say, has apples the size of a head, and Pesotsky, they say, has made his fortune with his garden. In short, Kochebe is rich and glorious, but one asks oneself, what is it all for? The garden is certainly fine, a model. It's not really a garden, but a regular institution, which is of the greatest public importance because it marks, so to say, a new era in Russian agriculture and Russian industry. But what's it for? What's the object of it?" "The fact speaks for itself." "I do not mean in that sense. I mean to ask, what will happen to the garden when I die? In the condition in which you see it now, it would not be maintained for 1 month without me. The whole secret of success lies not in its being a big garden, or a great number of labourers being employed in it, but in the fact that I love the work. Do you understand? I love it perhaps more than myself. Look at me. I do everything myself. I work from morning to night. I do all the grafting myself, the pruning myself, the planting myself. I do it all myself. When anyone helps me, I am jealous and irritable till I am rude. The whole secret lies in loving it. That is, in the sharp eye of the master. Yes, and in the master's hands, and in the feeling that makes one, when one goes anywhere for an hour's visit, sit, ill at ease, with one's heart far away, afraid that something may have happened in the garden. But when I die, who will look after it? Who will work? The gardener, the labourers? Yes, but I will tell you, my dear fellow, the worst enemy in the garden is not a hare, not a cockchafer, and not the frost, but any outside person." "And Tanya?" asked Kovrin, laughing. "She can't be more harmful than a hare. She loves the work and understands it." "Yes, she loves and understands it. If after my death the garden goes to her, and she is made the mistress, of course, nothing better could be wished. But if, which God forbid, she should marry," Yegor Semyonitch whispered, and looked with a frightened look at Kovrin. "That's just it. If she marries and children come, she will have no time to think about the garden. What I fear most is she will marry some fine gentleman, and he will be greedy, and he will let the garden to people who will run it for profit, and everything will go to the devil the very first year. In our work, females are the scourge of God." Yegor Semyonitch sighed and paused for a while. "Perhaps it is egotism, but I tell you frankly, I don't want Tanya to get married. I am afraid of it. There is one young dandy comes to see us, brings his violin and scraping on it. I know Tanya will not marry him, I know it quite well, but I can't bear to see him. Altogether, my dear boy, I am very queer, I know that." Yegor Semyonitch got up and walked about the room in excitement, and it was evident that he wanted to say something very important, but could not bring himself to it. "I am very fond of you, and so I am going to speak to you openly," he decided at last, thrusting his hands into his pockets. "I deal plainly with certain delicate questions, and say exactly what I think, and I cannot endure so-called hidden thoughts. I will speak plainly. You are the only man to whom I should not be afraid to marry my daughter. You are a clever man with a good heart, and would not let my beloved work go to ruin. And the chief reason is that I love you as a son, and I am proud of you. If Tanya and you could get up a romance somehow, then, well, I should be very glad, and even happy. I tell you this plainly, without mincing matters, like an honest man." Kovrin laughed. Yegor Semyonitch opened the door to go out and stood in the doorway. "If Tanya and you had a son, I would make a horticulturist of him," he said, after a moment's thought. "However, this is idle dreaming. Good night." Left alone, Kovrin settled himself more comfortably on the sofa and took up the articles. The title of one was "On Intercropping," of another, "A few words on the remarks of Monsieur Z concerning the trenching of the soil for a new garden." A third, "Additional matter concerning grafting with a dormant bud." And they were all of the same sort. But what a restless, jerky tone! What nervous, almost hysterical passion! Here was an article, one would have thought, with most peaceable and impersonal contents. The subject of it was the Russian Antonovsky apple. But Yegor Semyonitch began it with "Audiatur altera pars," let the other part be heard, and finished it with "Sapienti sat," the wise man is satisfied. And between these two quotations, a perfect torrent of venomous phrases directed at the learned ignorance of our recognized horticultural authorities, who observe nature from the height of their university chairs, or at Monsieur Gauscher, whose success has been the work of the vulgar and the dilettanti. And then followed an inappropriate, affected, and insincere regret that peasants who stole fruit and broke the branches could not nowadays be flogged. It is beautiful, charming, and healthy work, but even in this there is strife and passion, thought Kovrin. I suppose that everywhere, and in all careers, men of ideas are nervous, and marked by exaggerated sensitiveness. Most likely, it must be so. He thought of Tanya, who was so pleased with Yegor Semyonitch's articles. Small, pale, and so thin that her shoulder blades stuck out, her eyes, wide and open, dark and intelligent, had an intent gaze, as though looking for something. She walked like her father with a little hurried step. She talked a great deal, and was fond of arguing, accompanying every phrase, however insignificant, with expressive mimicry and gesticulation. No doubt she was nervous in the extreme. Kovrin went on reading the articles, but he understood nothing of them and flung them aside. The same pleasant excitement with which he had earlier in the evening danced the mazurka and listened to the music was now mastering him again and rousing a multitude of thoughts. He got up and began walking about the room, thinking about the black monk. It occurred to him that if this strange supernatural monk had appeared to him only, that meant that he was ill, and had reached the point of having hallucinations. This reflection frightened him, but not for long.
But I am all right. I am doing no harm to anyone, so there is no harm in my hallucinations, he thought, and he felt happy again. He sat down on the sofa and clasped his hands round his head. Restraining the unaccountable joy which filled his whole being, he then paced up and down again and sat down to his work. But the thought that he read in the book did not satisfy him. He wanted something gigantic, unfathomable, stupendous. Towards morning he undressed and reluctantly went to bed. He ought to sleep. When he heard the footsteps of Yegor Semyonitch going out into the garden, Kovrin rang the bell and asked the footman to bring him some wine. He drank several glasses of Lafitte, then wrapped himself up, head and all. His consciousness grew clouded, and he fell asleep. 4. Yegor Semyonitch and Tanya often quarreled and said nasty things to each other. They quarreled about something that morning. Tanya burst out crying and went to her room. She would not come down to dinner nor to tea. At first, Yegor Semyonitch went about looking sulky and dignified, as though to give everyone to understand that for him, the claims of justice and good order were more important than anything else in the world. But he could not keep it up for long, and soon sank into depression. He walked about the park dejectedly, continually sighing, "Oh, my God, my God," and at dinner did not eat a morsel. At last, guilty and conscience-stricken, he knocked at the locked door and called timidly, "Tanya, Tanya!" And from behind the door came a faint voice, weak with crying but still determined. "Leave me alone, if you please." The depression of the master and mistress was reflected in the whole household, even in the laborers working in the garden. Kovrin was absorbed in his interesting work, but at last he, too, felt dreary and uncomfortable. To dissipate the general ill-humor in some way, he made up his mind to intervene, and towards evening he knocked at Tanya's door. He was admitted. "Fie, fie, for shame!" he began playfully, looking with surprise at Tanya's tear-stained, woe-begone face, flushed in patches with crying. "Is it really so serious? Fie, fie!" "But you knew how he tortures me," she said, and floods of scalding tears streamed from her big eyes. "He torments me to death," she went on, wringing her hands. "I said nothing to him, nothing. I only said that there was no need to keep too many laborers. If we could hire them by the day when we wanted them. You know the laborers have been doing nothing for a whole week. I only said that, and he shouted and said a lot of horrible, insulting things to me. What for?" There, said Kovrin, smoothing her hair. "You've quarreled with each other. You've cried, and that's enough. You must not be angry for long. That's wrong. All the more as he loves you beyond everything." He has spoiled my whole life," Tanya went on, sobbing. "I hear nothing but abuse and insults. He thinks I am of no use in the house. Well, he is right. I shall go away. Tomorrow. I shall become a telegraph clerk. I don't care." Come. You mustn't cry, Tanya. You mustn't, dear. You are both hot-tempered and irritable, and you are both to blame. Come along, I will reconcile you." Kovrin talked affectionately and persuasively, while she went on crying, twitching her shoulders and wringing her hands, as though some terrible misfortune had really befallen her. He felt all the sorrier for her, because her grief was not a serious one, yet she suffered extremely. What trivialities were enough to make this little creature miserable for a whole day, perhaps for her whole life? Comforting Tanya, Kovrin thought that, apart from this girl and her father, he might hunt the world over and would not find people who would love him as one of themselves, as one of their kindred. If it had not been for those two, he might, very likely, having lost his father and mother in early childhood, never to the day of his death have known what was meant by genuine affection and that naive, uncritical love which is only lavished on very close blood relations. And he felt that the nerves of this weeping, shaking girl responded to his half-sick, overstrained nerves like iron to a magnet. He never could have loved a healthy, strong, rosy-cheeked woman, but a pale, weak, unhappy Tanya attracted him. And he liked stroking her hair and her shoulders, pressing her hand and wiping away her tears. At last, she left off crying. She went on for a long time, complaining of her father and her hard, insufferable life in that house, entreating Kovrin to put himself in her place. Then she began, little by little, smiling and sighing that God had given her such a bad temper. At last, laughing aloud, she called herself a fool and ran out of the room. When a little later Kovrin went into the garden, Yegor Semyonich and Tanya were walking side by side along an avenue, as though nothing had happened, and both were eating rye bread with salt on it, as both were hungry. 5. Glad that he had been so successful in the part of peacemaker, Kovrin went into the park. Sitting on a garden seat, thinking, he heard the rattle of a carriage and a feminine laugh. Visitors were arriving. When the shades of evening began falling on the garden, the sounds of the violin and singing voices reached him indistinctly, and that reminded him of the black monk. Where, in what land or in what planet, was that optical absurdity moving now? Hardly had he recalled the legend and pictured in his imagination the dark apparition he had seen in the rye field, when, from behind a pine tree exactly opposite, there came out, noiselessly, without the slightest rustle, a man of medium height, with uncovered grey head, all in black, and barefooted like a beggar, and his black eyebrows stood out conspicuously on his pale, death-like face. Nodding his head graciously, this beggar or pilgrim came noiselessly to the seat and sat down, and Kovrin recognized him as the black monk. For a minute, they looked at one another, Kovrin with amazement, and the monk with friendliness, and just as before, a little slyness, as though he were thinking something to himself. "But you are a mirage," said Kovrin. "Why are you here and sitting still? That does not fit with the legend."
"That does not matter,"
the monk answered in a low voice, not immediately turning his face towards him.
"The legend, the mirage, and I are all the products of your excited imagination. I am a phantom."
"Then you don't exist?" said Kovrin.
"You can think as you like," said the monk with a faint smile. "I exist in your imagination, and your imagination is part of nature. So I exist in nature."
"You have a very old, wise, and extremely expressive face, as though you really had lived more than 1,000 years," said Kovrin. "I did not know that my imagination was capable of creating such phenomena. But why do you look at me with such enthusiasm? Do you like me?"
"Yes. You are one of those few who are justly called the chosen of God. You do the service of eternal truth. Your thoughts, your designs, the marvelous studies you are engaged in, and all your life bear the divine, the heavenly stamp, seeing that they are consecrated to the rational and the beautiful, that is, to what is eternal."
"You said eternal truth. But is eternal truth of use to man, and within his reach, if there is no eternal life?"
"There is eternal life,"
said the monk. "Do you believe in the immortality of man?"
"Yes, of course. A grand, brilliant future is in store for you men, and the more there are like you on earth, the sooner will this future be realized. Without you who serve the higher principle and live in full understanding and freedom, mankind would be of little account. Developing in a natural way, it would have to wait a long time for the end of its earthly history. You will lead it some thousands of years earlier into the kingdom of eternal truth, and therein lies your supreme service. You are the incarnation of the blessing of God, which rests upon men.
And what is the object of eternal life? Asked Kovrin.
As of all life, enjoyment. True enjoyment lies in knowledge, and eternal life provides innumerable and inexhaustible sources of knowledge. And in that sense, it has been said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions."
If only you knew how pleasant it is to hear you, said Kovrin, rubbing his hands with satisfaction.
I am very glad.
But I know that when you go away, I shall be worried by the question of your reality. You are a phantom, an hallucination. So I am mentally deranged? Not normal?
What if you are? Why trouble yourself? You are ill because you have overworked and exhausted yourself. And that means that you have sacrificed your health to the idea, and the time is near at hand when you will give up life itself to it. What could be better? That is the goal towards which all divinely endowed, noble natures strive.
If I know I am mentally affected, can I trust myself?
And are you sure that the man of genius, whom all men trust, did not see phantoms too? The learned say now that genius is allied to madness, my friend. Healthy and normal people are only the common herd. Reflections upon the neurasthenia of the age, nervous exhaustion and degeneracy, etc., can only seriously agitate those who place the object of life in the present, that is, the common herd.
The Romans used to say, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body.
Not everything the Greeks and the Romans said is true. Exaltation, enthusiasm, ecstasy, all that distinguishes prophets, poets, martyrs for the idea from the common folk, is repellent to the animal side of man, that is, his physical health. I repeat, if you want to be healthy and normal, go to the common herd.
Strange that you repeat what often comes into my mind, said Kovrin. It is as though you had seen and overheard my secret thoughts. But don't let us talk about me. What do you mean by eternal truth? The monk did not answer. Kovrin looked at him and could not distinguish his face. His features grew blurred and misty. Then the monk's head and arms disappeared. His body seemed merged into the seat and the evening twilight, and he vanished altogether. The hallucination is over, said Kovrin, and he laughed. It's a pity. He went back to the house, light-hearted and happy. The little the monk had said to him had flattered, not his vanity, but his whole soul, his whole being. To be one of the chosen, to serve eternal truth, to stand in the ranks of those who could make mankind worthy of the kingdom of God some thousands of years sooner. That is, to free men from some thousands of years of unnecessary struggle, sin, and suffering. To sacrifice to the idea everything, youth, strength, health, to be ready to die for the common weal. What an exalted, what a happy lot! He recalled his past, pure, chaste, laborious. He remembered what he had learned himself and what he had taught to others, and decided that there was no exaggeration in the monk's words. Tanya came to meet him in the park. She was by now wearing a different dress. "Are you here?" she said. And we have been looking and looking for you. But what is the matter with you?" she asked in wonder, glancing at his radiant, ecstatic face and eyes full of tears. "How strange you are, Andrusha." "I am pleased, Tanya," said Kovrin, laying his hand on her shoulder. "I am more than pleased. I am happy. Tanya, darling Tanya, you are an extraordinary nice creature. Dear Tanya, I am so glad. I am so glad." He kissed both her hands ardently and went on. "I have just passed through an exalted, wonderful, unearthly moment. But I can't tell you all about it, or you would call me mad and not believe me. Let us talk of you. Dear, delightful Tanya, I love you, and I am used to loving you. To have you near me, to meet you a dozen times a day, has become a necessity of my existence. I don't know how I shall get on without you when I go back home." "Oh," laughed Tanya, "you will forget about us in 2 days. We are humble people, and you are a great man." "No, let us talk in earnest," he said. "I shall take you with me, Tanya. Yes? Will you come with me? Will you be mine?" "Come," said Tanya, and tried to laugh again, but the laugh would not come, and patches of color came into her face. She began breathing quickly and walked very quickly, but not to the house, but further into the park. "I was not thinking of it. I was not thinking of it," she said, wringing her hands in despair. And Kovrin followed her and went on talking with the same radiant, enthusiastic face. "I want a love that will dominate me altogether, and that love only you, Tanya, can give me. I am happy. I am happy." She was overwhelmed, and huddling and shrinking together, seemed 10 years older all at once, while he thought her beautiful and expressed his rapture aloud. "How lovely she is!"
This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of The Black Monk, Part 1 of 2 by Anton Chekhov. If you've enjoyed this episode, please become a supporting member by going to ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com and clicking the appropriate button. And thanks for pitching in. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper. Part of the Airwave Podcasting Network.